Welcome back. With the first day of school just a week away, Mayor Bill de Blasio and Department of Education Chancellor Maisha Ross Porter recently announced New York City school safety guidelines for students and staff this year. However, many feel the DOE's protocols and procedures are rushed, and the MORE Caucus UFT say that these measures are simply not enough. Joining us now to discuss this and more is Annie Tan, a special education teacher and activist, and as well as a member of the MORE-UFT Caucus. Welcome, Annie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, firstly, I want to start with just asking, how are you feeling? As an educator, I can imagine that this upcoming school year is bringing a lot of anxiety, a lot of mixed feelings for yourself and your colleagues.
Yeah, so I'm scheduled to go back to a windowless classroom next week, and I am terrified. I've seen colleagues who have ceilings with holes like there and liquid dripping, and we've seen like classrooms that like my colleagues across the city are saying like have mold and have all these other features that have never been fixed because we have been severely underfunded. So I'm very scared. My colleagues are very scared. And I think the difference now is that one, we have the Delta variant, but two, we're going to have overcrowded classrooms because all the kids are coming back.
A windowless classroom, that is insane to just think of with a pandemic. And, the fact that this happened last year, and now it's happening again this year, must be just anxiety riddling for everyone.
I wanted to say that my classroom wasn't windowless last year because the majority of our students last year were remote.
That's
And
right.
because most of our students were remote, my students could have a classroom with windows. And it's because my classroom is a smaller classroom. I'm a special education teacher with 12 students that we are in a smaller room. But because we're in the smaller room, we have to take the classrooms that are smaller, which are the windowless ones. And
Wow.
that's not okay.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that, Annie. We mentioned the protocols, the safety protocols that the mayor and the chancellor released earlier this week. What were your thoughts upon receiving these guidelines from the mayor and chancellor? And from your perspective and experience, are schools ready to reopen come September 13th?
No. I think that in-person learning is always better, but we need options for especially my elementary school students who cannot be vaccinated at this point. And I've heard concerns since May when the mayor announced this plan that a number of my students' families and a lot of students' families across the districts were not ready to send their kids back in September. They were not going to risk their kids' lives or their families' lives. And the main thing that struck out to me was ventilation, right? We have these district reports saying my classroom's safe just because we do have a supply and exhaust fan, but we have other cases where, like as I said earlier, my classroom doesn't have windows, and it has 2 air purifiers that aren't HEPA certified, and I should be very worried since I don't have windows in my classroom. But testing is a huge part of it that I am very worried that the DOE's testing policy of testing 10% of unvaccinated kids who give consent is not enough, because if parents don't give consent to their kids for getting tested, then really we're only going to have about 2-3% of our population getting tested twice a month. And we know vaccinated staff and vaccinated students can get and spread COVID. So that testing policy is, as Michael Elston-Rooney of the Daily News reported, 1/20th of what Chicago and LA school districts are doing, where they're going to be testing 100% of students and staff weekly.
Wow.
And that's where you catch cases, because if you don't test, then we can't see who has COVID, especially with asymptomatic people. And then we can't quarantine those classrooms. And, I've been reading online that there are people who don't want testing because they don't want their schools or classrooms to get closed because they're inconvenienced. And to that, I'm like, no, you know what's inconvenient but worse? people getting sick and
Mhm.
possibly having long COVID or even dying. We can't put people's inconvenience over the health and safety of our people. So I just could not believe the lack of those safety measures in play, especially when the mayor said we are going to have 3 feet of social distancing where possible.
Mm.
Because a lot of our classrooms will not be able to fit 32 students in a classroom with 3 feet distancing. It's just not going to happen.
Right. On top of that, Annie, this year I read that city officials are not setting a specific number of COVID cases to close a school. So, what are your concerns with this? There's no determination of how many COVID cases will warrant a school closing. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so even September 1st during the council hearing, the Dave Chachki, I'm not
Mhm.
sure how to pronounce his name, the health commissioner said they will deploy disease detectives to figure out whether there's spread in a school. But as I said earlier, how can you know whether there are cases in a school if you don't test?
Mhm.
And why use the phrase disease detectives? Aren't those contact tracers, right? Where's the science around disease detectives? If you don't have guidance on how a school closes or how I mean, we know how a classroom closes, but if we don't have guidance on how a school closes and we just have to trust that the DOE's disease detectives can spot spread of cases, there's no real scientific basis on how to close schools at all. I think, though a lot of people have been saying, what's 3 feet of distancing? How does how was that calculated? How
Mhm.
was even ventilation measures calculated? And I know that the district has given all schools like these carbon dioxide monitors to see how airflow is being exchanged in
Right.
classrooms, but they're not required to use them in all classrooms. And that would overload our custodial engineers who are already
Mhm.
overworked working around the clock fixing the HVAC systems, the piping, all the issues that make schools not very safe for our kids. Um, so the fact that, even just September 1st, they just made this guidance out saying that middle school and high school teachers are going to have to make new paperwork for their students uh, digitally if they're quarantining and then open office hours. That was brand new news to our middle and high school educators who um, unfortunately are hearing about their jobs not through the mayor or the chancellor, but through Twitter and other
Mm.
social media platforms. And it's just utterly disrespectful to have us and students on the ground going through untested, protocols that may or may not keep us safe without actually letting us know and having us give input on what will actually make our school safe.
Annie, I wanted to go back to a point you brought up earlier about the vaccination mandates for children. So, currently, educators are required to be vaccinated and have at least their first dose by September 27th for the school year. There is no current COVID-19 vaccination mandate for children in New York City public schools, however. How are educators feeling about this?
Yeah, so I've heard from educators that they're upset about the vaccine mandate. At the same time, I want every single person possible to be vaccinated in our classrooms if they're working with children who cannot be vaccinated. Um, and this is not to, you know, disagree. I disagree with my colleagues who believe they shouldn't get the vaccine. I believe everyone should. Um, but that our students, I think as many people as possible should get the vaccines because we know the hospitalizations, cases, and deaths are mostly of the unvaccinated. And I hear communities who are concerned about the vaccines. But we know, like, overall, we've seen how the vaccine has operated through millions and millions of people. I'm fully vaccinated. I was fine. Many, many others are fine too. And I would, hope that me and others standing before you saying like these vaccines are safe and will keep our community safe might be enough. Um, I hope my colleagues take the vaccine. I don't know what's going to happen in school if uh, if and when people oppose the vaccine mandate. I think that is an issue.
Right. Thank you for sharing. So something else I wanted to bring up was that educators and parents have started a hashtag Restore Remote campaign. Can you tell us about the demand for remote learning at this time and a little more about this campaign as well?
Absolutely. So the MORE Caucus and many parent groups and now council members and politicians have really pushed for a remote option that will allow for families who still are worried about their children not being able to be vaccinated, worried about household members who are immunocompromised, to be able to stay remote until we have vaccinations. But we also know that vaccinations are not enough to keep our students and staff safe. And we also know that if we were to, you know, make sure our communities are okay, that we need to provide them the Wi-Fi, the devices, the resources necessary in order to be safe, especially when quarantines happen. And they will happen, and children and staff will get sick under this plan. And so instead of having schools flip-flopping and families who are not ready to return be forced back 100% in person, let us have a remote option that actually keeps schools safer. The
Right.
less people that are in the school building, the better. I will have less kids crowded in a windowless classroom. In fact, if more kids went remote, just like last year, I might be able to have a classroom with windows this year.
Mhm.
But that's not possible with 100% in person. And we know that this is an airborne virus. So we know that even our Department of Education workers are working remotely right now as much as possible because we know that less bodies in the buildings means it's safer. So give families the remote option. Teachers, we all did the remote option last year, and as much as we hated it, it's safer. It's not
Mhm.
about whether we feel it's better or not. It's about making sure we're safe. And there needed to be a lot more planning so that all of this doesn't fall on teachers in the fall and for the rest of the school year. And I'm just going to say one more thing that September 1st at the city council hearing, Chancellor Porter said that we are ready to pivot to remote learning at, you know, the
Mhm.
snap of a finger, which we are not. We are not ready to go to remote learning immediately. The mayor and the chancellor have said since May that we are going to be 100% in person. And when there needs to be a remote option, it will be on educators and staff and
Mm.
families to scramble to figure out how to make that remote option work. And that's not okay. Our
Right.
mayor and chancellor and the Department of Ed should have been planning a remote option since last year, frankly.
Annie, thank you so much for joining us today. I wish we had more time. Thank you for your advocacy and your activism and your education of our students and our children, especially during these tough times. I hope that, these conversations continue to happen and that perhaps, that can lead to an extension of some sort so that things can be sorted out before 13.
I agree. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, folks, that's all for our show today. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, wishing you and your safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.